September 15th, 1944. Peleliu. A Japanese machine gunner squeezes his trigger and 40 rounds rip across the white coral in under 3 seconds, and the lieutenant leading the assault drops face first into the burning dust with 2 bullets punched through his chest before he can finish the word forward. The Marine beside him takes the same spray across the shoulder and goes down, screaming into the reef. And the man crouched behind them both, a broad-backed sergeant, who 6 years earlier was welding ship hulls in a smoke-choked Pennsylvania steel yard, does not freeze. He does not fall back. He does not wait for someone to tell him what happens next. He rolls left into a shell crater, wipes another man's blood out of his eyes, and starts barking new firing positions to 8 terrified men he has never once been formally ordered to command. In the next 4 minutes, that welder-turned-sergeant will reorganize a leaderless assault, redirect it around a machine gun nest nobody briefed him on, and take a fortified ridge from a direction the enemy swore was impossible. And high above him, watching through the slit of a fortified cave, a Japanese regimental officer will write in his diary that night that he does not understand what he is fighting, that these Americans do not behave like soldiers, that they behave like something he has no word for. Before we go any further, do us one small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join our community of history lovers as we uncover the forgotten moments, the impossible odds, and the ordinary men who changed everything. We drop a brand new documentary every single week, and trust us, you do not want to miss where this story is about to go. Because what that Japanese officer witnessed on Peleliu was not a fluke. It was not luck. It was the visible edge of a secret the American military had spent 30 years quietly building into ordinary men. A secret so effective, it left the Imperial Japanese Army writing baffled after-action reports until the very last week of the war. This is the story of why Japanese commanders could not explain how Marines kept fighting after losing half their officers. And it starts with a problem that on paper should have destroyed the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had settled into a grinding, murderous rhythm. Island by bloody island, the Americans clawed their way toward Japan, and the Japanese made them pay for every yard in blood. But there was a specific terrifying pattern buried inside the casualty reports that few civilians ever understood. The men dying fastest at rates that should have been mathematically catastrophic were the officers, the lieutenants, the captains, the men whose entire job was to think for the unit and tell everyone else what to do. The Japanese had figured out something devastating. Kill the officer, and in most armies on Earth, you kill the unit. A leaderless platoon in 1944 was supposed to do one of 3 things: freeze, fall back, or die in place waiting for orders that would never come. So the Japanese built their entire island defense around one merciless idea. Do not just kill Americans, kill the right Americans first. Japanese snipers on Peleliu, on Tarawa, on Iwo Jima were specifically trained to identify officers and shoot them before anyone else. They watched for the man reading a map, the man holding a radio handset, the man pointing where others looked. Pre-registered artillery was zeroed onto the exact folds of terrain where officers would naturally gather to coordinate an attack. Machine guns were sighted to sweep the ground where command clustered. The entire lethal architecture of the defense was pointed at the American brain, not its body. And it worked. The officer casualties were real, and they were staggering. On Tarawa, assault battalions lost their commanders at rates that any military textbook in the world would have called operationally fatal. On Iwo Jima, the killing was so concentrated in the opening hours that regimental colonels found themselves talking directly by radio to sergeants leading platoons because every single officer between them was already dead or bleeding out on the black sand. By every rule the Japanese had ever been taught, this was the winning move. Decapitate the enemy, and the body collapses. Their doctrine, their training, their entire theory of war promised it. A unit that loses its officers loses its mind. It fragments. It seeks cover. It waits. This was not a Japanese superstition. It was the accepted wisdom of nearly every professional army on the planet, including their German allies, who had taught them so much. There was just one problem. The Marines had never read that rulebook, and nobody on the Japanese side could figure out why. But everything was about to change because of a kind of man the Japanese command never thought to account for. A man nobody in Tokyo had ever bothered to study. He was not a general. He was not a graduate of a war college. He was more often than not a nobody. A farm boy from Iowa, a short-order cook from Detroit, a mechanic, a dock worker, and in the case of the man in that Peleliu shell crater, a welder who had spent his teenage years fusing steel plates in the roaring heat of a Monongahela River shipyard, breathing metal smoke, learning to stay calm and precise while sparks rained down and the whole world screamed with noise. He was in his late 20s, older than most of the boys around him, with forearms like cable, and a voice that could cut through artillery. Before the war, he had never given an order in his life, beyond telling an apprentice to hold a plate steady. He had joined the Corps in the late 1930s, not out of some grand vision, but because the yard work was drying up, and 3 meals and a bunk sounded like a fair trade. He was not born a leader. Nobody looking at him in 1938 would have marked him for anything special at all. But the institution he walked into had already decided something about him that he had not yet decided about himself. It had decided he was a leader, whether he felt like one or not. And through years of relentless, deliberate training, it set out to build that leadership into his bones. Terrain analysis, fire and maneuver, how to call for artillery and naval gunfire, how to give a clear order to frightened men under a hail of steel. These were not skills reserved for the officers above him. In the Marine Corps, they were the expected competence of a sergeant tested and proven before he was ever allowed to pin on the rank. By the time the welder stood on the deck of a landing craft off Peleliu, something had happened to him that the Japanese defenders bleeding him from those caves could not see and could not have understood. He had become a man the institution had specifically deliberately built for the exact moment when every officer above him was dead. And that idea that ordinary tradesmen and farm boys should be trained to seize command the instant their leaders fell was in its own quiet way one of the most radical, almost heretical ideas in modern military history. Because to the Japanese, it bordered on madness. To understand why you have to understand what an officer meant in the Imperial Japanese military. He was not simply the man who gave orders. He was the living embodiment of the Emperor's will inside the unit. He carried the divine authority that made the unit's violence legitimate. Without him, the men below did not merely lack a leader, they lacked permission to act at all. Initiative from an enlisted man was not celebrated. It was suspect. Acting without an officer's sanction even to win was a form of insubordination. A soldier's supreme virtue was flawless obedience, not independent thought. So the notion that you would take a cook or a welder and train him to override the chain of command, to look at a collapsing attack and redesign it on his own authority in the middle of a firefight, struck the Japanese mind as not just wrong, but almost obscene. It inverted the entire sacred order of things. It handed the emperor's authority to a nobody with dirt under his fingernails. When American thinkers and Marine officers had first pushed this philosophy decades earlier, plenty of traditional soldiers scoffed at it too. Trust the sergeants to run the battle. Let corporals rewrite the plan. It sounded like a recipe for chaos for 1,000 privates, each fighting their own private war. It sounded to many like a dangerous fantasy. But the men who built the modern Marine Corps had learned a brutal lesson in the small forgotten wars of the early 20th century in the jungles and mountains of Nicaragua, Haiti, and Santo Domingo. Out there, patrolling roads that ran for miles between any senior officer and the fighting they had discovered, a truth that no parade ground could teach. Combat does not politely distribute itself by rank. The lieutenant gets shot. The captain gets hit. The map means nothing when the situation changes faster than a runner can carry a message. And the man standing there with a rifle, whatever his rank is, the man who has to decide. And if he has not been trained to decide, then the decision simply does not get made, and men die for nothing. So the Corps made a choice that other armies flinched from. It decided that the death of the leader was not a rare catastrophe to be endured. It was a normal, expected, constant feature of small unit combat. something to be planned for at every single level. And it would build that expectation into every man it touched from the first brutal day of boot camp forward. Which brings us back to the welder in the shell crater on Peleliu, 4 minutes into the worst day of his life, with his lieutenant dead in the coral, and 8 terrified men looking to him with nothing but a question in their eyes. He did not give a rousing speech. There was no time and no breath for it. He did what the institution had spent 6 years grinding into his reflexes until it was faster than thought. He counted his rifles. He read the ground. He saw at once that the original plan, the frontal push the dead lieutenant had been leading, was suicide now, with only 8 men. So he threw the plan away. In seconds, on his own authority, he redrew the entire attack. He had spotted something. A shallow gully, a fold of dead ground running to the right, low enough that the Japanese machine gun sweeping the front could not depress into it. The enemy had not covered it because the enemy had assumed correctly by their own doctrine that a leaderless remnant of 8 men would never have the coordination to find it and use it. That assumption was about to cost them the ridge. He tapped 2 men and pointed. He sent them crawling into the gully, first low and fast, rifles up. He held the rest back to spit fire at the machine gun slit, not to kill it, just to make the gunner keep his head down and his eyes forward for 90 more seconds. Then he took the last 5 men and followed the first 2 into the dead ground, moving in the crouched, economical way a man learns when he has spent years working in tight, dangerous spaces where one wrong step means a burn or a broken bone. They came up out of that gully on the enemy's flank, from a direction the defenders had left almost bare because it was not supposed to be possible. The welder and his 8 men took the position in a short, savage rush of grenades and point-blank rifle fire, and the coral strongpoint that had bled the whole company fell to a squad that no longer had a single officer left alive. It had taken him roughly 2 minutes longer than the dead lieutenant's original plan. Just 2 minutes start to finish. That was the entire cost of losing every officer in the assault. Not collapse, not retreat, not a broken leaderless mob waiting to be slaughtered. 2 extra minutes, and then the objective in American hands. And up in his cave, the Japanese officer watching through the slit lowered his field glasses and could not make sense of what he had just seen. His training had promised him that killing the leaders would kill the attack. He had done everything right. His snipers had done their work. The officers were dead. By every law, he believed in those Marines should have gone to ground and stayed there. Instead, they had reorganized in minutes, found the one seam in his defense, and walked right through it, as if some invisible hand had told each man exactly what to do the instant the man above him fell. That night he opened his diary and wrote the words that would haunt Japanese command reports for the rest of the war. The Americans, he wrote, do not fight like men. They fight like something else. He did not have a word for it. His military culture had never produced the concept, so it had never produced the word. But this, the welder taking a ridge with 8 men on Peleliu, was only the beginning. Because this was not one gifted man having one brilliant day. This was a machine. And in the weeks that followed, entire companies would fight for days under the command of sergeants. Whole regiments would be bled white of officers and keep advancing. And the Japanese high command would slowly, disbelievingly be forced to confront a possibility more disturbing than losing a battle. That they were losing over and over again to a single idea their entire proud civilization had been built to reject. But could that idea survive what was coming next? Could ordinary men keep this up when the killing ground grew from one ridge to 500 connected caves, when the officers did not just fall in the opening minutes, but kept falling for 5 straight days? In Part 2, we walk into the meat grinder, the Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge, where 3 of 4 rifle companies would lose every officer they had. And we will finally see whether the Corps had truly built something unbreakable, or whether the welder in the crater had simply been one lucky man on one impossible morning. When we left him, the welder from the Pennsylvania steel yards had just taken a coral ridge with 8 men and no officers. In 2 minutes longer than the plan, the dead lieutenant never got to finish. 1 ridge. 8 men. A single savage rush through dead ground, and a Japanese officer in a cave writing that the Americans did not fight like men. But one ridge was nothing. One ridge was the doorway. Beyond it rose the thing the Marines would come to hate more than any patch of ground in the entire Pacific. A shattered spine of coral limestone riddled with more than 500 connected caves, every mouth of every cave zeroed to cover the mouth of the next. They called it the Umur Brogol. The men who bled on it called it Bloody Nose Ridge. And in the days ahead, it would swallow officers so fast that by the 5th morning, 3 of the 4 rifle companies in an entire Marine regiment would be commanded by sergeants. The command tent did not believe that was survivable. The doctrine said a regiment that lost its officers lost its war. And this is where everything got worse. The trouble did not come from the enemy first. It came from the American side of the line, from a colonel who had built his entire life on a single idea. Officers win battles. Will wins battles. You find the enemy, you fix him, and you drive straight into him with everything you have until one of you breaks. It had worked for him before. It had made his name. And now on this rock it was killing his regiment faster than the Japanese ever could. For 4 straight days he ordered the same thing. Frontal assault. Up the bare coral slopes into interlocking machine gun fire against caves that could not be seen until they opened up at 30 yards and cut a platoon in half. Each morning, fresh men went up. Each evening, a handful crawled back. The colonel measured the battle the only way he understood by the officers he had left to lead it, and every single hour that number fell. By the 4th day, his regiment had lost more than 1,700 of its roughly 3,000 men. Nearly 2 out of every 3. Whole platoons had ceased to exist as anything you could mark on a chart. Companies of 180 were down to 40. And still the order came down the line unchanged, unbending. Again, same slope, same direction, more will. The welder, now running what was left of a rifle company with a staff sergeant's chevrons and a dead captain's responsibilities, stood in a shell hole, listening to a runner scream that order into his good ear over the noise of the guns. He looked at the 40 exhausted men who were all that was left of 180. He looked at the slope that had already killed every attempt made from that exact angle. And for the first time in the whole bloody campaign, he said the one word that could put a Marine in front of a court-martial. "No," he said. "Not that way. Not again. We go up there like that, and every man in this hole is dead by noon for nothing. For nothing." The runner stared at him like he had lost his mind. "That is a direct order from Regiment Sergeant." "Then regiment can climb up here and give it to my dead themselves," the sergeant said. He did not raise his voice. That was what made it terrifying. "Tell them I will take the ground. I will not take it their way. Not one more time." It was insubordination in front of witnesses. By the letter of the rules, it was a career ended, and in the wrong commander's hands, worse than that. The division commander had promised this entire island would fall in 3 days. They were on day 4 of what would grind into more than 2 months of killing, and a staff sergeant with dirt under his nails had just refused a colonel's attack to his face. Regiment prepared to send someone up to break him, but before they could, the sergeant found an ally he never saw coming. The ally was a battalion operations officer, a major who had spent the last 3 sleepless nights doing something almost no one above the fighting line had bothered to do. He had actually read the reports, not the casualty totals at the top of the page. The details buried underneath them, the after-action scraps written in pencil by men who had watched their friends die. And in that grim paperwork, he had found a pattern that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Every position on that ridge that had been taken and held, he realized had not been taken by the great frontal assaults the colonel kept ordering. Not a single one. They had been taken by small clusters of survivors' squads and half squads led by corporals and sergeants who had quietly thrown the official plan into the coral and gone in sideways. Through gullies. Around flanks. Into the seams, the big attacks stepped right over. The officers who carried the grand plans kept dying at the line of departure in the first 30 seconds exactly where the enemy wanted them to die. The sergeants who improvised kept crawling back with ground. The major carried a folder full of it into the command tent and he was not a rebel by nature. He was a cautious, methodical man, and what he had found scared him more than the Japanese did. "We are not losing because our men lack courage," he told the senior officers standing in that tent. "Every man who went up that slope was brave. We are losing because every plan we make dies the same instant the man carrying it dies. And he always dies first. The Japanese have been hunting our officers since the opening hour. They are very good at it. But the small units, the squads, they keep functioning after we are gone. They reorganize. They keep taking ground. So stop building the battle for the officers. Build it for the sergeants. Give them the objective. Do not give them the route. And then for once, get out of their way." It was heresy, and everyone in that tent knew it. In most armies on Earth, it would have been laughed straight out the flap. To hand the shape of an attack to enlisted men, to trust a welder and an Iowa farm boy, to redraw an assault on their own authority, in the middle of a firefight, cut against everything the traditional command believed about how war was supposed to be run. Command flowed down. It did not bubble up from the men holding the rifles. But the numbers in that folder had stopped being an argument. They had become a verdict. And there was no time left to debate it. Casualties were climbing by the hour, so the tent gave the major exactly one thing: one chance, one objective, one morning. If the sergeants could take a strong point that 4 days of frontal assault had failed, even to scratch the whole approach on the ridge would change. If they failed, the welder would answer personally for the men he had refused to send up the slope. The day of the test came in a gray, wet dawn. And if it failed, the sergeant would not live long enough to see it questioned. The objective was a knuckle of coral. The men had started calling the anvil a low fortified knob near the crest that anchored the entire Japanese line on that flank. 4 frontal attacks had gone straight at it. 4 had been torn apart on the open rock. The anvil had already cost more than 90 Marines killed and wounded, and it had not moved 1 inch. It sat there covered by at least 3 cave positions and 2 heavy machine guns firing on fixed pre-laid lines, and by every measure, it should not have been takeable by the 40 tired men the welder had left in the world. He did not plan to attack it head-on. He never once intended to. In the black hours before dawn, he crawled the ground himself alone, the way the shipyard had long ago taught him to move through tight killing spaces where one wrong step burned or crushed you. And he found the thing that 4 straight days of frontal thinking had walked right past. A dry drainage cut waist-deep running up the left side of the anvil. Dead ground. The fixed machine guns could not depress their barrels into it. The caves could not see past a shoulder of rock that hid its whole length. It was narrow. It was slow. But it would carry men to within a grenade's throw of the nearest cave mouth before the enemy fired a single shot. It was exactly the kind of seam the big attacks had been built to ignore. He split his 40 into 3 parts. 10 men he left low on the old blood-stained approach with every automatic weapon he could beg or scavenge, and he gave them one order and no other. Do not advance a single yard. Make noise. Make the Japanese absolutely certain that the 5th frontal assault was grinding right up the same suicidal slope as the 4 before it. Their entire job was to be a lie the enemy already wanted to believe. The second group, 15 men, he fed into the drainage, cut on their bellies in the last minutes of darkness. The third group he kept tight behind them himself, at their head, every man loaded down with grenades and satchel charges. Then he waited on the enemy to make the mistake he had built for them. At first light, the 10 men below cut loose, every barrel they had hammering the base of the slope, and the anvil answered exactly as he had prayed it would. The 2 fixed machine guns swung down and forward toward the noise, toward the frontal ground, toward the easy killing they had already won 4 times over. Their gunners locked their eyes on the lie and never looked left. The 15 men in the cut moved, fast now out of the dark, up the dead ground into grenade range of the first cave, before its defenders even understood that the real attack was climbing the side of the mountain they had believed was safe. The sergeant went up right behind them with the demolition men, and his heart slamming against his ribs, and there was one moment the whole thing nearly came apart. A Japanese soldier stepped out of a lower cave they had never spotted straight into the drainage cut rifle, already coming up, and for half a second, the entire plan hung on that one man's trigger finger. A 19-year-old rifleman 2 feet ahead of the sergeant fired first from the hip without aiming, and the man went down. The plan lived. Nobody breathed. They kept moving. They reached the first cave and put satchel charges into its mouth before its machine gun could traverse back around toward them. The blast folded the entrance inward on itself, and the gun went silent forever. The second position was blind now, its covering fire destroyed, and they rushed it with grenades from an angle it had never been built to defend, an angle its designers had sworn no enemy could ever reach. In under 12 minutes of close, filthy, screaming point, blank fighting the anvil that had stopped 4 full assaults and killed or maimed 90 men, fell to a staff sergeant, a demolition team, and a lie told by 10 Marines who never once left their holes. The men who came up behind to hold the ground found the welder sitting against the captured coral, deaf in one ear from the charges, his face black with smoke, quietly counting his people, the way he always did. He had taken the anvil with 4 men wounded and 1 dead. 5 casualties. 4 frontal assaults had spent more than 90 on the same rock and taken absolutely nothing. 90 against 5. The difference was not courage. Every man in every one of those 4 dead attacks had been brave beyond words. The difference was a sergeant the institution had spent 6 years training to think finally turned loose to do it. Down in the command tent, the officers who had gathered to watch the test fail watched instead a strong point fall in 12 minutes that had held against everything for 4 days. First, there was a stunned silence. Then disbelief. Then slowly, something that was not quite comfort on the faces of men who had just watched a core belief die. The major quietly closed his folder. It did not need to be opened ever again. But taking 1 knob of coral was one thing. Winning a war with the idea behind it was something else entirely. The order went out across the whole division. Stop feeding the frontal assaults. Give the small units objectives and let their leaders find the road. Trust the sergeants. It was not a clean revolution. It never is. Some officers hated it in their bones, took it as a personal insult to the entire meaning of command, muttered that you could not run a war by letting corporals vote on the plan. Fresh replacement lieutenants stepped off the boats straight from the States and had to be quietly, patiently taught by grinning, filthy sergeants that up here on this particular ridge, you handed a man the objective, and then you shut up and listened to the fellow who had lived on the rock for a week. One of the first men to prove it beyond the welder's own company was a corporal 2 ridges over 20 years old who had inherited his squad when a mortar round killed the sergeant above him. He did not send a runner asking what to do. He read his ground, borrowed the anvil trick almost word for word, pinned a cave with 3 riflemen, and flanked it with the rest, and took a position his platoon had been ordered to bypass as too costly. When the lieutenant who had given that bypass order came forward an hour later, the corporal simply pointed at the captured cave and said, "It's yours, sir. We didn't wait." The lieutenant new to the ridge learned the most important lesson of his war in that one sentence. But the ground began to move. Position by position, cave by cave, the Umurbrugol was cracked open, the same way the anvil had been, by small groups going in sideways under leaders who did not wait for permission from anyone. Where a frontal assault had once traded a dozen men for nothing, a flanking squad now traded 1 or 2 for a cave. The frontal casualty lists finally thinned, and for the first time in the entire battle, the gains held. The regiment that had lost nearly 2/3 of its men was at last pulled off the line, so wrecked that it had to be relieved outright and replaced by army infantry brought in from reserve. But the lesson it had bought in blood did not leave the ridge when the survivors did. It stayed in the mouths of the sergeants, who were still standing, and it went on taking ground foot by foot. And on the other side of the wire, deep in the caves, the Japanese commanders watched their beautiful murderous design come apart in their hands, and could not name the thing dismantling it. They had killed the American officers exactly according to plan. The paralysis they had been promised in every manual never arrived. Instead, the American attacks kept reorganizing without leaders, kept finding the one seam that was supposed to be covered, kept coming from the flank of the mountain that was meant to be impossible. Their own losses, which were supposed to bleed the Americans white on the open slopes, now bled inward, cave by cave, position by position, as an enemy they could not decapitate chewed its way straight into the heart of the ridge. In the days after the anvil fell, the flank that had held for 4 days against everything gave up more than a dozen strongpoints, and the killing that was supposed to break the Marines was breaking the mountain instead. An idea that a colonel had tried only days earlier to have court-martialed off his own ridge had just rewritten how the deadliest ground in the Pacific would fall. But here is what the exhausted men on that rock did not yet know. The Japanese were no longer only dying on the Umurbrugol. Somewhere behind their lines, a staff officer with a careful, frightened, honest mind of his own had begun to do the very same thing the American major had done. He had started to read, to study the pattern in the reports, to ask the forbidden question that no one in his army was supposed to ask. Why will these Americans not die when we cut off their head? And the answer he was about to write down would climb all the way up the Japanese chain of command, past the dead of Peleliu toward Okinawa, and the last and largest bloodletting of the entire war. Because the instant the enemy truly understood the secret, they would try to do one of two things: build it themselves before it was too late, or find a way at any cost to break it. And the real war, the war between two entire ways of making men fight, was only just beginning. It began as one welder in one shell hole saying a single word: no. Then it became a test on a knob of coral called the Anvil 5 Casualties, where 4 frontal assaults had spent 90. Then at last, it became an order across a whole Marine division: trust the sergeants. Give them the objective, not the route. And on the ridges of Peleliu, it cracked open a mountain of 500 caves that was never supposed to fall. But at the end of part 2, we left a warning hanging in the smoke. Behind the Japanese lines, a staff officer had started to read. He had begun asking the forbidden question: why will these Americans not die when we cut off their head? And his answer was about to climb all the way to the top of the Japanese command, toward the last and largest island of the entire war. Now the enemy knew. Now the enemy was ready. They had studied it, named it, and built an entire island to break it. And this was no longer an experiment, no longer a single ridge, no longer a test. This was Okinawa. The report that traveled up the Japanese chain in early 1945 was unlike almost anything else in their military records. It did not blame American courage. It did not blame luck. It did the one thing Japanese doctrine found almost impossible. It admitted a structural weakness in their own army and a structural strength in the enemy's. The author, a senior staff officer who had studied the island battles in detail, wrote plainly that American infantry could reorganize themselves at the small unit level in a way Japanese forces simply could not replicate. He traced it to one specific thing. The Americans pushed real tactical authority downward to the sergeants and corporals as a matter of institutional standard. Japanese doctrine did not permit it. Japanese training did not build it. And in his final section, he recommended something close to heresy: rebuild Japanese NCO training from the ground up to give sergeants the same independent decision-making the Americans had. It was an extraordinary admission, but it came far too late to matter. You cannot rewrite 30 years of culture in the weeks before a battle. What the Japanese could do was change the ground itself. The defense of Okinawa was engineered around a single brutal calculation. If you cannot stop the American small unit machine, you bleed it. You make it pay for every yard until the cost becomes unbearable. So the Japanese 32nd Army, more than 100,000 strong, abandoned the beaches almost entirely. No banzai charge at the waterline. No easy targets. Instead, they dug into the ridges of the south into a defensive belt anchored on the ancient stronghold of Shuri, layered with reverse slope positions, interlocking caves, and pre-registered artillery zeroed onto every approach a rifle company would ever use. Every gun was aimed at the seams. Every cave was sighted to cover the flank the last cave could not see. They had studied the American flanking game on Peleliu, and they built terrain specifically to punish it. If the sergeants wanted to come in sideways, the Japanese would make every side a killing ground. And in the opening weeks, it worked better than anything they had tried before. American casualties on Okinawa did not climb. They exploded. Over the 82 days of the battle, the United States would suffer more than 49,000 casualties, with over 12,000 dead across all services. On the ground in the mud of the Southern Ridges rifle companies were being ground down faster than at any point in the Pacific War. The killing was industrial. The rain turned the battlefield to a sea of stinking mud, and the mud filled with the dead of both sides. The numbers for a while seemed to prove them right. In the first week alone, some American assault battalions took casualties running past a third of their strength. Rifle companies that had landed 180 strong were counting 60 men, then 40, then fewer. The Japanese gunners behind Shuri fired tens of thousands of rounds a day into pre-plotted boxes, and every box was a place where the small unit machine liked to maneuver. For the first time in the Island War, the enemy had built a defense that seemed to feed on the very thing that had beaten them before. The Japanese watched their plan bleed the Americans by the thousand, and allowed themselves for the first time in months to believe. Bleed them enough, and even the small unit machine would run out of men to feed it. Kill enough sergeants, and there would be no next man to step up. But officer casualties were not the only threat anymore, because the machine had a hidden weakness, and Okinawa was about to find it. Here was the crisis nobody in the command tents wanted to say out loud. The Marine system worked because it distributed leadership to trained men. Sergeants who had spent years learning terrain fire and maneuver. Corporals who had been built for the moment the officer fell. It was a machine that ran on experience. And on Okinawa, the experience was dying faster than it could be replaced. By the second month, the veteran corps was being burned out of the rifle companies. The sergeants who had learned their craft on Guadalcanal and Peleliu were falling in the same mud as the lieutenants. And behind them came the replacements. Green boys 18 years old, some rushed through training and thrown onto the line with barely a name learned before the man beside them died. The doctrine assumed the next man down was ready. But what happened when the next man down had been on the island for 6 hours? Companies that had reorganized flawlessly on Peleliu now stumbled. A squad would lose its sergeant and find that the corporal behind him was a replacement who had never led anything. The chain of succession, the thing that had terrified the Japanese, began to strain. In a few terrible cases, it broke. Units froze. Attacks stalled. Men died in the open because no one who knew the ground was left standing to move them. And the knives came out. In the rear, some officers who had always hated the whole idea seized their moment. This is what happens, they said, when you build your army on sergeants instead of officers. Kill enough of them, and you have nothing left. You have handed the war to boys. The doctrine that had looked invincible on Peleliu now looked to its enemies like a house built on sand. They had a point, and everyone knew it. A machine that runs on experience is only as deep as its bench, and Okinawa was chewing through the bench faster than any battle before it. Some rifle companies rotated through their entire complement of squad leaders more than once in a matter of weeks. The pipeline back in the States was real, but it took months to build a competent sergeant and hours to kill one. For a few grim days in the mud below Shuri, the arithmetic looked like it might finally beat the idea. The welder was on Okinawa too. Promoted now a gunnery sergeant, patched up after Peleliu, and sent back into it because men like him were too valuable to keep in a hospital. And even he felt the doubt crawl in. He watched a replacement freeze under fire and get 3 men killed. He watched the machine he believed in sputter. One night, soaked and shaking with cold, he wondered for the first time whether the whole idea had a ceiling, whether there was a level of slaughter past which no training could hold. Then came Sugarloaf, and Sugarloaf answered the question for good. Sugarloaf Hill, Okinawa, May 1945. It does not look like much. A low, ugly hump of coral and mud, maybe 300 yards long, barely 50 feet high. But it is the western anchor of the entire Shuri line. Take it, and the whole Japanese defense begins to unravel. Fail, and the drive south dies in front of it. The Japanese know exactly what it is worth. They have turned it into a fortress. It does not stand alone. 2 more hills sit behind it, and every one of the three covers the other two with interlocking fire. Machine guns rake the slopes. Mortars drop on the crest by the hundred. Artillery from behind Shuri is pre-registered on the top so precisely that any man who reaches the summit is dead in seconds. To take Sugarloaf, you must hold ground that the enemy can erase on command. The assault begins in the middle of May, and immediately the officers start to fall. The lieutenants go first. Snipers mortars the pre-registered guns, exactly as designed. Within the first hours, platoon after platoon loses its leader. And now comes the test the doubters swore the Marines would fail on ground this savage. The sergeants step up. The welder is there when his own lieutenant drops. He does not pause. He counts his rifles. He reads the ground. He sends men. The hill changes hands once, then again. The Marines fight to the crest, and the pre-registered artillery erases them, and they fall back, and they go up again. Once, twice. By some counts, Sugarloaf changes hands 11 times in 7 days of fighting. 11 times. Up and down that bloody hump of mud, each attack led not by fresh officers, but by whoever was still alive to lead it. Take the crest. Lose the crest. Regroup at the base. Go again. The welder pulls the same trick he pulled on the anvil, scaled up and screaming. Pin the front with fire. Send men into the dead ground on the flank. Hit the reverse slope caves from an angle they cannot cover. He loses men. He gains yards. He loses the yards. He takes them back. Bodies pile in the mud. Corpsmen crawl through fire to drag the wounded down. The rain hammers everything. Men fight for hours with no officer within 200 yards, and they do not stop because the institution built them not to stop. A tank crawls up to blast a cave and is killed by a hidden gun. A flamethrower man burns out a bunker and drops 30 seconds later. A private takes a satchel charge from a dead demolition man he has never met and finishes the job the dead man started. Nobody tells him to. He just does it because that is the reflex the Corps hammered into him. The welder screams himself hoarse over the guns. He grabs a green replacement by the collar and points. That cut. Now, 2 men, go. The boy goes white with terror and comes back an hour later with the cut cleared and a wound in his arm and a look in his eye that says the terror is behind him forever. The machine is not just holding. It is building new parts out of the boys who survive. Higher up, a battalion is being run by a captain who is the last officer left in it, talking by radio directly to sergeants because there is no one in between still alive to relay the order. It is exactly the nightmare the doctrine was built for. And it works. The captain gives objectives. The sergeants find the roads. The hill keeps changing hands, and every time it changes back into Marine hands, it is a sergeant, not a general, standing on the crest. On the worst day, a single Marine company is reduced to a fraction of its strength and is being led by a sergeant with a shattered hand who refuses to go to the rear. He organizes the defense of a scrap of the crest against counterattack after counterattack through the night. Green replacements who froze a week earlier learn in the most brutal classroom on earth to move when the man beside them moves. The ones who live become veterans in a single night, and slowly, impossibly, the machine holds. It does not run smoothly. It grinds. It bleeds. The 6th Marine Division pays a horrifying price around Sugarloaf, more than 2,000 killed and wounded, with over 1,000 more men knocked out of the fight by sheer combat exhaustion. But the hill does not break the Marines. The Marines break the hill. On the 8th day, the crest holds. The interlocking fire from the 2 hills behind it is finally silenced. Cave by cave, flank by small groups of men, led by corporals and sergeants, who found every seam the Japanese swore they had covered. Sugarloaf falls, and behind it, the western hinge of the Shuri line swings open. The Japanese defenders who survived it could not comprehend what they had witnessed. They had built the perfect killing hill. They had bled the Americans by the 1,000 on it. And still the attacks kept coming, kept reorganizing, without leaders, kept crawling up out of ground that was supposed to be certain death. One of the surest defenses in the entire Pacific had been taken not by a brilliant general's master plan, but by the accumulated refusal of hundreds of sergeants to stop. And the news of what happened at Sugarloaf traveled fast in both armies. For the Americans, it was proof. The doubters in the rear fell silent. The idea that the doctrine would collapse once the veterans died had been tested on the worst ground of the war, and it had held. The machine could absorb even Okinawa's slaughter because the training pipeline kept shoving the next man forward and the next man terrified, and Green kept becoming the leader the moment the institution needed him to. With Sugarloaf gone, the Shuri line unraveled. The Japanese 32nd Army, its western flank shattered, was forced to abandon the fortress it had built, its entire defense around, and fall back to the south, into a final pocket, where it would be destroyed. Of the more than 100,000 Japanese defenders on Okinawa, the overwhelming majority died. The bleeding strategy had been designed to make the small unit machine too expensive to run. It had failed. The machine had simply refused to stop feeding itself. Across the Pacific, the pattern was now undeniable. Unit after unit reported the same thing. Where authority was pushed down to trained sergeants' formations that should have collapsed under officer losses, kept functioning at a level no enemy could match. Compare the two armies at the moment of crisis, and the gap is total. A Japanese platoon that lost its lieutenant in the first 30 seconds of an assault often did not complete that assault at all. A Marine platoon that lost its lieutenant completed the same assault 2 minutes late under its sergeant. Multiply that single difference across every squad, every platoon, every company on every island, and you have the reason the Pacific went the way it did. The doubters were not just silenced. They were converted. The same rear echelon voices who had sworn the doctrine would collapse once the veterans died, now watched Okinawa, the worst meat grinder of them all, and saw it hold. The lesson was carried home and written into the training pipeline for good. The next generation of Marines would be built on the same foundation, tested against realistic standards, before promotion taught from the first day of boot camp that the death of the leader was not an emergency, but a normal condition of combat to be planned for at every level. The men who had bled to prove it began at last to be recognized. Battlefield commissions, meritorious promotions, the Navy Cross and the Medal of Honor pinned on the chests of men who a few years earlier had been welders and farmers and short-order cooks with no idea they were leaders at all. And in the Japanese records, the final verdict was written by the Japanese themselves. That staff officer's recommendation to rebuild their NCO Corps in the American image sat in a report recovered from a storage cave after the battle. It was an admission of defeat deeper than any surrender document. It said in effect that they had been beaten not by better weapons or greater numbers, but by a better idea about ordinary men. And they had understood it too late to save themselves. The welder came off Okinawa alive. Barely. Deafer in one ear, older in the eyes. One of the last men still standing who had said no in a shell hole on Peleliu and lived to see the idea behind that word win a war. From one man in a crater to the fall of the last great island fortress in the Pacific. From a court-martial threat to the doctrine that broke the Shuri line. The ordinary men the enemy could never account for had changed the entire shape of the war. But here's the question this story has been building toward all along. What happened to the men behind it? What happened when the guns finally went silent, and the welders and farm boys took off the uniform and went home? And what happened to the idea itself? The strange, radical, once forbidden idea that a nobody with dirt under his nails could be trusted to lead, because the story of Sugarloaf and Peleliu was only ever half of it. The other half is what the world did with the lesson afterward, and what it cost the men who taught it. This story still has one final chapter, and it is the one almost no one ever tells. A welder in a shell hole said no. That word became a test on a knob of coral 5 casualties where 4 assaults had spent 90. The test became a doctrine, and the doctrine cracked open the caves of Peleliu and broke the killing hills of Okinawa, and along the way it left the finest defensive minds in the Japanese army, writing baffled reports about an enemy they could not decapitate. From one man to the fall of the last great island fortress in the Pacific. But at the end of part 3, we ask the question this whole story was built to answer. What happened to the men behind it? And there is a twist waiting in that answer. One that almost no one who tells this story ever reaches, because the truest part of it is also the quietest. Because sometimes the men who change everything are given nothing, and sometimes what they leave behind is larger than any medal could ever hold, larger than any name in a history book, larger than the man himself ever knew while he was alive to see it. This is the last chapter. And it begins the day the guns finally went silent. When the war ended, the welder did not come home a legend. That is the first hard truth of this story. There was no ticker tape parade for a gunnery sergeant. There was no newsreel with his name on it. He came home the way most of them came home, on a crowded ship, in a uniform that no longer fit the man inside it, to a country that wanted very badly to forget the smell of the islands and get back to building refrigerators and having children. He went back to the steel town. He went back to the welding. He put the torch to the plate the same way he always had, calm and precise, while the sparks rained down, and if his hands were steadier than other men's, if the noise never rattled him, the way it rattled the young apprentices, no one asked why. The metal. When it finally caught up with him in the mail, went into a drawer with the socks. He did not hang it on a wall. He did not talk about the anvil, or sugar loaf, or the boy he had grabbed by the collar and sent into a drainage cut in the rain. Men who have seen what he saw rarely do. He married. He raised children who knew only that their father was quiet, that he did not like sudden loud sounds, and that on certain nights in the spring he would sit on the porch for a long time and say nothing at all. He grew older in the way the whole generation grew older, without complaint, without medals on the mantle, folding the worst years of his life into a silence that his family learned not to open. When his grandchildren were small, one of them found the medal in the drawer once and asked what it was for, and he looked at it for a long moment and said only that it was for a day he did not much like to remember, and that the men who had really earned it were still on an island a very long way away. Then he closed the drawer, and that was the end of it. Was that a tragedy? For decades it looked like one. The men who did the impossible were absorbed back into ordinary life so completely that the country almost forgot what they had done. The sergeants who had run whole battles when every officer was dead went back to being welders and farmers and mechanics, and the world went on above them, as if the victory had belonged to the generals whose names filled the history books. But the moment that redeemed all of it came late, and it came quietly at a reunion of the division some 40 years after the war. An old man crossed a crowded hotel ballroom on unsteady legs, looking for a face he had carried in his memory for 4 decades. When he found the welder Gray, now stooped, he did not salute. He took the old sergeant's hand in both of his and held it, and for a moment he could not speak at all. He was the green replacement from Sugarloaf, the terrified boy who had been grabbed by the collar and sent into the cut. He had lived. He had gone home and married and built a life, and he had spent 40 years knowing exactly why he was alive to build it. When he finally found the words, they were very simple. He said that he had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and that every single one of them existed because a man he barely knew had looked at him in the worst moment of his life and decided he was capable of more than he believed. Then the 2 old men stood in the middle of that ballroom and wept, and neither of them was ashamed. That was the reunion. That was the reward. Not the medal in the drawer. The 7 grandchildren of a boy who should have died in the mud. And what of the others who shaped that story? The cautious major who had read the reports and staked his own career on the sergeants who had walked into a command tent with a folder and said stop building the battle for the officers went home too and lived out his life, knowing he had once seen a truth clearly and refused to stay silent about it. The corporal who had taken a bypassed cave 2 ridges over on Peleliu, 20 years old, and unwilling to wait for permission, survived the war and told the story to his own grandchildren, though he never could make them understand quite how much one small decision on a coral ridge had mattered. And the colonel, the hard-driving man who had tried to court-martial a sergeant for refusing to send men up a slope to die, faded into the long quiet of retirement, his name attached in the histories, not to the ridge he took, but to the men he spent taking it. The battle sorted them all in the end, more honestly than any medal board ever could. But here is the thing the welder himself never fully understood. His real legacy was not that reunion moving as it was. His real legacy was that the idea he had bled to prove did not die in the drawer with his medal. It walked off those islands, and it never stopped walking, because the doctrine that ordinary men could be trusted to lead did not end when the Pacific War ended. It became the foundation of how the United States Marine Corps trained every generation that followed, and then it spread far beyond the Corps. In the frozen hills of Korea, only 5 years later, it was tested again in conditions as brutal as any island. At the Chosin Reservoir in the murderous winter of 1950, Marine units surrounded and outnumbered by as many as 10 to 1 fought their way out through mountain passes in temperatures that froze weapons and men alike 30 degrees below zero and colder, and once again the fighting came down to small units, led by sergeants and corporals, making decisions on their own authority when the officers could not reach them. The men who came out of Chosin were carrying the same institutional reflex that had come off Peleliu. It held again in a place where by every rule of war it should not have. It held in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, where the war was fought almost entirely at the level of the squad and the fire team, where a corporal on a jungle trail was often the only leader within miles, and had to decide in seconds questions that could shape the entire war's headlines. The concept even earned a name in the decades that followed. Military thinkers began to speak of the strategic corporal, the recognition that in modern war, a single junior enlisted man's decision made alone, and in an instant could carry consequences all the way up to the level of nations. The Marines had been building that man since before Pearl Harbor. Now the whole idea had a title, and it did not stay American. Armies around the world studied the pattern. The principle of pushing real decision-making authority down to the men closest to the fight, of giving them the objective and trusting them to find the road, became one of the central ideas of modern Western military doctrine. Today, it is often called mission command, and it is taught in war colleges on several continents. Its deepest root is the same lesson a colonel once tried to court-martial a welder for acting on, nor did the idea stay in uniform. The same principle that the person closest to the problem often understands it better than the person at the top quietly reshaped how the best companies and hospitals and rescue services in the world learn to operate. The organizations that empower the person on the front line to make the call, rather than forcing every decision up a chain that moves too slowly to matter, are drinking from the same well the Marines dug on Peleliu. They may not know the name of a single sergeant on Sugarloaf, but they are living out his lesson every time a nurse overrides a chart, or a line worker stops a factory, or a young employee is trusted to decide instead of made to wait. The numbers behind that legacy are almost impossible to fully count because they are measured in absences. Every unit across 8 decades that kept functioning after losing its leader instead of collapsing. Every attack that was completed by a sergeant instead of failing when the lieutenant fell. Every man who came home to his family because the group around him reorganized in the chaos instead of freezing. Across Peleliu, Okinawa, Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since, the lives preserved by units that refused to stop functioning when decapitated run easily into the tens of thousands. It is a monument with no name on it, built out of the men who lived because the man beside them was trained to step up. But the greatest lesson of this whole story was never really about tactics at all. Look closely at what actually happened, and the deepest truth of it has nothing to do with coral or caves or drainage cuts. It is a truth about where good ideas come from, and about the institutions that so often refuse to hear them. The Marine Corps won its edge by betting on a radical proposition, that the man with dirt under his nails, the welder, the farm boy, the short-order cook, might be capable of far more than the world assumed, if only an institution took the trouble to build him for it, and then trusted him to use it. The Japanese army, for all its extraordinary discipline and courage, could not make that bet. Its entire structure was built to concentrate wisdom at the top and demand obedience below, and when the top was killed, the structure had nothing left to draw on. 2 philosophies of the human being met on those islands. One believed leadership was the property of the few. The other believed it could be built into almost anyone. The second one won. That is a pattern that repeats across all of history, far beyond this one war. Again and again, the ideas that changed everything were dismissed at first as insane, and the men who carried them were laughed at before they were followed. The aircraft carrier was mocked by admirals who worshipped the battleship right up until carriers made the battleship obsolete in a single afternoon at Pearl Harbor and again at Midway. The strange collection of modified tanks built for the D-Day beaches contraptions that could swim and clear mines and lay bridges were called ridiculous toys until they saved thousands of lives on the sand. The proximity fuse, a shell smart enough to sense its own target, sounded like science fiction, until it was shooting enemy aircraft out of the sky and breaking German counterattacks in the Ardennes. Every one of those ideas was once somebody's madness. Every one of them was resisted by the very institutions it went on to save. And every one of them, like the welders, needed not just an inventor, but a system with the courage to gamble on it. And that resistance is not a story about the past. It is the same story that plays out in every hospital, every laboratory, every company, every army in the world today, wherever a person low in the hierarchy sees something the people above them cannot and has to find the courage to say, "No, not that way," when the whole weight of the system is telling them to stay silent and follow the plan. Most of the time that person is punished for it the way a colonel once tried to punish a welder. Once in a while someone with authority is wise enough to listen, and the world quietly changes. The welder in the shell hole is not just a figure from 1944. He is a question posed to every institution that has ever existed. Are you brave enough to build your people to think, and then brave enough to listen when they do? And there is one final detail in this story that almost no one knows, a detail that quietly reframes everything that came before it. Here is the twist. The Marine Corps did not invent this idea on Peleliu, or on Guadalcanal, or in the desperation of the Pacific War. It had already written the whole thing down. Years before Pearl Harbor, in the small forgotten campaigns in the jungles of Nicaragua, Haiti, and Santo Domingo, Marine officers had learned this exact lesson the hard way, and a handful of them had bothered to write it into a manual. That book, published quietly in 1940, more than a year before the war reached America, laid out in plain language the philosophy of small units, of decentralized decision-making, of trusting the junior leader on the ground. The blueprint for how the Pacific would be won was sitting on a shelf, printed and bound before the first shot was ever fired. Almost no one read it. It was an obscure document about brushfire wars that most of the military considered beneath serious attention, a slim book about jungle patrols and bandit chases in countries the public had already forgotten. And yet, it became, by the judgment of later historians, one of the most quietly influential military texts of the entire century. Everything the Japanese defenders could not understand from their caves, everything that made their careful island fortresses come apart in their hands, had been anticipated and written down by a few Marine officers years before, in the calm prose of men describing lessons learned in the mud of the Caribbean and Central America. The secret weapon that broke the Japanese island defenses was never a weapon at all. It was never classified. It was never patented or hidden in a vault. It was hiding in plain sight in a training pipeline and a dusty manual in the simple, revolutionary decision to look at an ordinary man and see a leader. The welder never knew he was living out a philosophy that had been written down before he ever enlisted. He only knew that when the moment came, his hands were steady and his mind was clear, and he understood what to do. He never read the manual. He did not have to. The manual had already read him years earlier, when it decided that men exactly like him were the answer. That was the whole idea, working one man at a time, exactly as its authors had hoped. So here is the whole story gathered into a few sentences. From a welder with a torch, and no rank worth mentioning, to a word set in a shell hole that should have ended his career, to a doctrine that broke the deadliest defenses in the Pacific, and then quietly shaped how armies would fight for the next 80 years. He proved that leadership is not the property of the privileged few, but something that can be built into almost anyone if only we have the courage to try, and the patience to train it, and the humility to listen when they answer, And because of that idea, tens of thousands of men across 4 generations of war came home to their families who otherwise would not have. 7 grandchildren in a hotel ballroom, and behind them a number so large that no monument could ever hold all the names. Multiplied by a count no one will ever finish making. The Japanese commander was right in the end. The Marines did not fight like ordinary soldiers. They fought like ordinary men who had been told and finally believed that they were something more. That was the secret he could see, but never name from his cave on the ridge. It was never about the coral or the caves or the guns. It was about a choice 2 nations made long before the first landing craft ever dropped its ramp, about what they believed their ordinary people were worth. It was about what an ordinary person becomes the moment someone decides to trust him. It is an old and dangerous idea, and still the truest one we have. And that far more than any island is the ground this whole story was fought for and won.